My relationship to hunting has always been this mixed affair. I grew up in Western Kentucky. I think a lot of you know that. And my father, Rick Herbert, was a big hunter. He was always in the field hunting white-tailed deer or duck. He was a big duck hunter in his day. My grandfather hunted. My grandmother hunted. My whole family, we fished. We come from a family of cat fishermen, right? And my friends always hunted growing up. And naturally, it was the thing that I used to separate myself from as a kid, right? I wanted to be different. So I pushed away from hunting, from the outdoors, from that component of what it meant to be not only a member of my family, but what it meant to be from Kentucky. And then later on in life, I kind of rediscovered that. I really kind of came back to it. I had this whole new appreciation for reconnecting with the land and thinking about what the land and natural resources, including the animals and fish, meant to me, and what that engagement meant to me as well. And there became a whole new appreciation for it as I kind of got back into it. And I don't get to hunt as much as I want to, though it's a thing that I want to kind of do if I'm lucky enough to spend another year here in Colorado, because we've had such this amazing bounty out here. And there are people out there who I respect so much, people like Steven Rinella of Meat Eater fame, who does such an amazing job talking about the importance of hunting and land stewardship to communities across the country, and of course with the tribal members that I work with now. So when I saw that Dr. Julia Brock had a new book coming out on hunting, I wanted to have her on the podcast immediately. And the book is called Closed Seasons, The Transformation of Hunting in the Modern South. And Julia she's associate professor of history at the University of Alabama, just this amazing school and program. She does so much work in public history, this field we're trying to understand and define and build right now. And the conversation we have today kind of shows you what you can do through hunting, talking about class and race and sexuality and power and land and resource management. And she does all of that, talking about the deep South, talking about Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, but also just a smidge of Florida as well. This is my podcast, after all, so we're going to talk about Florida. But we have the most amazing conversation, and I get to have the most amazing conversation with the most amazing human today with Dr. Julia Brock. So I hope you enjoy the conversation we're going to have here. We're talking about so much more than hunting, so much more than people, so much more than land. This is a conversation that really goes a lot of different places and reveals some really interesting stuff about the early 20th century South and how that affects us all the way to today. So sit back and relax, because my conversation with Dr. Julia Brock starts right now on Reckoning with Jason Herbert. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is a reckoning. So now I feel, with the countdown, okay, now I feel special and so forth. All right, I'm excited to talk to you about this book. I read the whole thing. I was talking to Sonia Bonczyk over at UNC Press. She's like, not all the people read the books. I'm like, how could I not read this thing? This is like my people you were writing. Our people, I guess, now that I've read it. You know? Are you kidding me? This was like, I was watching Meat Eater. Do you watch Meat Eater? Are you familiar with Steven Rinella? It's imagine if like Tony Bourdain was a hunter. Okay. Anyway, that was watched, and then I had this book over the last few days as I was reading through it. It's late where you are, right? Are you Eastern or Central? Where are you?
Well, I'm Central at 6:00, but it is at the end of a long day, so sorry if I'm a little glazed.
Did you teach today?
I did. It's my long teaching day, which was a good day.
Okay.
It's our advising season too, so it's busier than normal. So lots of excited students.
Okay, I have a lot of questions to ask you about teaching and advising. We're going to talk about public history as well, because I'm all fired up after coming back from a campus tour where I was talking and stuff like that and stuff. I like and so forth. So before we get into that, let's introduce you. Like, you want to tell us who you are and like what you're doing here? How's
Yes,
that?
thank you again. It's so wonderful to be here. It's such a treat. I'm Julia Brock. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Alabama. I came here in 2018 to begin a public history program at UA. And so I coordinate a concentration in public history at UA in addition to being a part of the history faculty.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm here in Tuscaloosa.
This is close to home for you, yeah? I mean, this is
I'm from Northwest Georgia, Rome. So
okay.
very close.
Yeah, I am. So I grew up in Western Kentucky in a little town called Murray. I always tell people that I flunked out of Murray State twice as a kid. That's the reason why they should trust my PhD credentials. And then also this little town called in Louisiana called Brobridge, which is near Lafayette and stuff. So like, and then Clarksville, Tennessee. So like all over the South and stuff. And like I was reading, okay, I tell you, the first thing I did was like start reading your acknowledgments because I want to see who we knew. It's my favorite part.
It's the best part to write too, because it's sort of this reflect. It's time to reflect and feel all the gratitude. And it could have been longer.
Are you worried about like when you're writing the acknowledgments, like that you're going to leave somebody out? Because I would be terrified of this process.
I am, and I kept close notes. I mean, even from my dissertation days, because some of it comes from my dissertation, and I just knew I was going to leave someone out. As you know, right? This is indeed a collaborative effort, and so many people sort of are constituted in this effort. But it was lovely to finally get to write and sort of narrate things.
Well, it reminded me as I was reading it, I was like, and I was taking notes like when I was in graduate school. When I would go to an archive, I'm like, write down the archivist's names, write down the librarian's names. It's just so little of a thing just to remember them and say thank you because they do so much lifting.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You know. And then we know a bunch of people like Heather Copelson.
Yeah.
She was stuck with me in Chicago for a summer once.
Like stuck in what were you all doing?
We did a paleography workshop at the Newberry. And I really over-exaggerated my Spanish-speaking ability. So I got in there, and I was so awful, and she was great. So she was knitting the whole time, as you can probably.
Yeah, Heather is a lovely colleague and an incredibly talented creator. In fact, we have a really great makerspace in Tuscaloosa. So we often see the creations of her, knitting and weaving and spinning, but she's also doing a lot more, creating all kinds of like cool stickers, and she's just very creative and also collegial and wonderful.
No, I love her to death, and she has not been on the podcast, so I don't even know how to feel. Like I haven't fine. I should probably reach out. All right, you were talking earlier. You were saying it's been a long day. You've been teaching all. How are you functioning at this point in time? Because I taught when I was teaching in high school, I would come home and like be completely drained. I couldn't people. So now you have to be up for a podcast. Like, what did you teach today? What were you teaching this semester?
Well, I teach an intro to public history class every fall, which is wonderful. And so I had that today. And then I'm teaching what we call our capstone course for seniors and history major. And so students are choosing a topic and producing a 15 to 20 page research paper. And it's such a lovely group of students. It just gives me energy. Actually, this semester the classes are really great. And I'm doing some independent studies too, which is fun. And it's a way to kind of bring curriculum to grad students sometimes in public history when those classes don't quite fit in the rotation. And so it's a busy semester, but it's a good one. Despite
I don't know how you're doing it. Do you want to talk about public history? Because we were talking about this, like stuff we want to talk about. I want to talk to you about this book and stuff like that. But also, like, I was just on this tour in Missouri talking to students and universities. And one of the things that I've really wrestled with, Julia, is like what public history is. When I would go in the job market, I went on a few public history job market interviews and stuff like that. And they would like, okay, can you define public history? And I'm like, oh man, I don't think these people know what public history is because, I don't know. Like in your own mind, what is this field? Because I feel this weird tension, right? When I talk to people about like, why are we having to like make these differences between history and public history, or have we not sussed this out yet? Like, I don't know. Like in your mind's eye, what are you telling students when they ask you like, why am I in this class? Or what is a public historian?
Yeah, I think that's a great point too about the kind of binary that was constructed. The first public history programs began in the late 70s, right? Then people began to think of these sort of different tracks. But in fact, there's much common ground. And I would give a big shout out to my colleagues at Alabama because many of them are engaging in public history work, even though because they don't have a credential, they sort of demur. And I don't think they would adopt the, professional title of public historian. It's hard. It's hard. I mean, students are confused when they see the term. I remember when I first stumbled into my initial public history class as a sophomore in college, and I thought, as opposed to private history. I mean, what is this, right? And so students often think about it as a vocational track, right? Like if they're interested in museums or historic preservation or archives or nonprofit NGO work, right? This could be a policy. This could be an option for them. But, I think the field and the way it defines itself has changed over time. And you're right. I think there's not like a concise elevator pitch that's always ready for public history. I mean, what the National Council on Public History says is, it's putting history to work in the world in a number of different ways as historians. I think about it as an engaged process, right? So it's a process that involves collaboration. It involves, a kind of reflective or reflexive practice. It involves service to a community or group, whatever that might be, right, in the co-production of history. And so it's more to me sort of a set of principles and ethics than like a product, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love the idea, like you're talking about, like of service. I kind of definitely feel like what I'm doing right now, it's that collaborative, let's go, togetherness.
I listened to your episode on the camping trip, and I had that thought, right? Like it's
man, that was so much. Like that camping trip was just like, I came back from that camping trip with the Comanche kids, and I was just like, well, you listen to it. I think I was high on life coming back from that. I was so pumped up about like, these are the cool things you can do. As like, I don't do the work that I do like in a regular job without history. And I'm constantly saying to my bosses who listen to this podcast, by the way, and I'm still somehow employed, like, history informs what I do. That's the reason why I have to continually go to these conferences and all this kind of stuff, because it's like history still is like this guiding principle, of stuff. I don't know, but I also feel, Julia, have you seen like, departments and stuff like that being able to quantify like on our end, like what, like for tenure or this, that, it's like what counts as public? Because we typically, for people listening in, typically it's like, okay, to get a tenure position, you write your book or a few articles or bookend articles or God knows whatever, right? But public historians are different, right? We're not necessarily focused as much on the manuscript.
No, this has been a perennial problem for public historians who go into the academy, especially, at R1 institutions who really are, feel that the kind of book is your path forward, right? Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of folks who came before me, like who were slightly older than me, and they had trouble with tenure because there was no way. It's not apples and oranges, right? It's difficult to say, an exhibit is worth whatever, like a peer-reviewed article, because these are different sorts of processes and products. I would say for my case, I was lucky in that University of Alabama really took to heart. There's some great white papers produced by the NCPH, and of course, there's been recent recommendations by the AHA and others on how to recognize engaged scholarship. And so that was, considered, but it's definitely the sort of book and change. It's kind of the and change. So it's considered scholarly activity, but I would not have gotten tenure on public history work alone.
Could you get tenure on dove hunting skills alone? Because your book, this is my segue, your book opens up in a field with people hunting. And I do you hunt now? Is this a thing is this a thing you've continued to do? Or like you grew up, I think you and I probably had some pretty similar backgrounds. Like you grew up in these dove fields and so forth, right?
Yeah, I did. I had, Rome is right on the Alabama border. And so, of course, I had Alabama family and in Center, and they held these annual dove hunts that were huge social occasions. And, as my father remembered to me, really the kind of the ritual beginning of fall. Everyone looked forward to it, right? It was a day of hunting and then a night of revelry. And yeah, we were given, guns at really young ages.
Yes, I still have mine.
I remember the blowback viscerally. I no longer hunt. I have familial ties to hunting still, and I fly fish occasionally, but I do not hunt.
I'm wondering though, like, so I think this was the cool thing is I started to kind of conceptualize what a hunt is, right? It like as your book opens up, it's like here's this communal gathering, it's celebrating of seasons. It's like you're talking about one family inviting another family in on this thing. This is like this whole social thing, and are people surprised when you're writing a book about hunting? Like I almost find sometimes like when I'm wrestling with describing who I am, like as a human being, right? Is hunting somehow anti-academic or something like that? Have you found surprise when you were like, hey, I'm talking about the history of hunting and this is important, this is an important thing?
At least not that anyone has admitted to. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
once you start talking about, right, the sort of the things that matter to historians that are at the intersection of hunting, right, like social status, class, gender, race, the environment, landscape, right, all of these things are sort of bound up in an activity that is still, fairly common in our region, right, and I
Mm-hmm.
think it lends itself um, to examination. And I think I would argue it's underexamined as a historical topic.
Yeah. As I was, there are all these like as people read this book, there's all these great, delicious characters to talk about. We'll talk about some of them today without giving away the whole thing and stuff. But like, okay. And I kept thinking about this in terms of like land and power and law and like there's all this stuff you can unravel. And as I was making my notes, which I have right in front of you here, like my big question, Julia, was like, where do we even begin with this? Because this is really kind of a transformative process, late 19th, early 20th century, and so forth. Where do we start with the story? Should we lay out, like, I guess after the Civil War, what is going on these? Because I kept thinking about, wow, these are originally native lands. Then there are lands that have been hunted and fished by black folk or whites. Where are we, I guess, immediately after the Civil War when it comes to like who gets to hunt on these lands? Who's doing the hunting? What's being hunted? For people listening in the South, in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, what's hunting following the Civil War? I guess let's
Yeah.
start there.
Yeah. I mean, and I would say, the heart of the story is really about the closing of the commons.
Mm,
And I wondered if that intersected into your research in Florida and, sort of cattle and farming
definitely.
called it, but we can talk about that. Yes. So, prior to about the 1870s, there was the expectation in the South, if you were white, no matter your class, that you could hunt on unfenced lands, right? It wasn't unlimited access, but there was an open range. And there were, for the large part, things like trespass laws that were there to stop you, or stock laws, right, to stop you. And so people, generally speaking, had an expectation of customary access to land. For enslaved men and free blacks, right, that was limited. Their, so-called slave codes, right, they regulated when and under what conditions enslaved men could have guns and dogs. And even free black men were circumscribed in these ways. Now, of course, enslaved men did hunt, and there's some great, amazing scholarship on what that meant for them. I'm thinking about David Silkenat's recent work on, Scars of Land, and then
Sure.
Michael Brown at Georgia State writes really beautifully about the way that there are kind of through traditions from West Africa that show up in hunting, especially in the Low Country, South Carolina. And so certainly people did hunt. But by the 1870s, there are efforts in a variety of ways to close the range. And hunting and fishing laws become another one of them. So in some ways, it's like a prop to the changing political economy of the post-war South. And you see this in a couple ways. I mean, obviously the fence law debate, which has been written about and debated, you also start to see kind of a patchwork of hunting and fishing laws, or laws regulating hunting and fishing in different ways, kind of spring up in counties, like countywide or even beat-wide laws, but largely with no arm of enforcement, right? So there's nobody, even if there's a closed season and, I don't know, Jefferson County, Alabama, nobody's there enforcing it. So a law passed is not necessarily a law enforced. And so, by the end of the 19th century, we start to see a change. And that's what I wanted to document, right? The efforts to actually centralize state power in the project of regulating access to the natural world.
We talk about hunting and so forth. And I'm looking at there's a just gorgeous image of like a stag over your left shoulder here.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh, I love it. I can't. It's so pretty. Can we talk a little bit about what's being hunted, Julia? Just kind of lay this out for people who are not of the land like you and I are from the South. I know that you and I are talking about this, and I very viscerally know these fields in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. What are people hunting there? Like, what are the game that's being taken?
Yes, great question. I want to come back to that though.
Please.
We've talked about the broader culture of hunting.
Mm-hmm.
That piece is interesting. But yeah, I mean, so there was a real consciousness that certain species were being overhunted and sort of were leaving, subregions of the South. So though deer were still hunted, they were becoming scarcer in the South, right? Certain animals like wolves and big cats, right, were already sort of bear was hunted, definitely. What's interesting is that by the end of the 19th century, one of the kind of emerging popular species was quail. The quail had been hunted in the 19th century, but not as extensively as like waterfowl. And so quail become really popular by the turn of the 20th century for a variety of reasons. It's hard to shoot on the wing. It takes skill. It takes a good dog. And in some ways, sportsmen, men who could, increasingly sort of identified as sportsmen, came to focus on different kinds of game like quail that they saw as requiring a bit more skill and mastery.
Mm-hmm.
So game is sort of shifting. And then people were also killing for commercial and food purposes, right? So, I mean, people were trapping for fur. Some communities in the South were killing songbirds because they fancied them as a delicacy, right? So you can also look at these sort of regional and sub-regional trends in what was hunted.
When we talk about who's hunting, I'm immediately thinking immediately of men, Julia, but also in my mind's eye, I have a picture of my grandmother with a bow and arrow and a white-tailed deer in like 1957 or something like that, because she was a devout hunter when she was a young lady. Did you see in the archive? Are you seeing? Is this a uniquely masculine thing in the late 19th century? Are women hunting at this point in time? Like, who's doing? I see all these amazing, like for anglers, women, especially black women, who are going out and catching catfish and stuff like that for their families. But are women hunting as well, or is this kind of only masculine?
Very few women are hunting at this time. And I think you're right. I think by the 90s that starts to change. There's some good scholarship on that. There's a scholar at Georgia Southern, Drew Swanson, who's actually writing on deer hunting and bow hunting as this kind of emergent phenomenon. But yeah, I think women fish. Women, when you sort of look at fishing licenses weren't required at this time when these new laws were passed. But when you look at, say, who's being arrested for supposedly violating any sort of fish laws, it's women more than men. And so women certainly were fishing, but very few women that I have seen in the record were actually hunting. And that, that changes over time. I mean, by the early 20th century, some women hunted because women cared about horsemanship and other things. And so the fox hunts became more appealing to women after the turn of the 20th.
I'm also wondering about, you and I both know this, like, it's expensive to gain a firearm. And I kept thinking about, of course, in the modern era, you can go to like Shields or wherever who is encouraged to sponsor this podcast. But I'll gladly sell it to Johnny Morris as well. But you can go and get these like $10,000, $12,000, $20,000, Italian shotguns and such. But even then, like, it costs money to get these things, especially say in the case of like sharecroppers and so forth, who are kind of building themselves back up. Did you notice any kind of classist issues when it comes to like actually obtaining, the firearms necessary to go, harvest, white-tailed deer or turkey or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, that is when, something that you'd mentioned in our correspondence, like the NRA, right, is starting rifle clubs, and you start to see much more kind of attention paid to make hunting rifles more sophisticated. And there's even efforts, and we can come back to this, in these early attempts to sort of create game and fish commissions to sort of regulate some of that. So there was a real concern about pump guns, like pump shotguns, right, and what that meant for sportsmanship. Yeah, most Southerners had an old beat up shotgun that, maybe an old 20 gauge or something that they had for years or passed down. What I will say that I did find that, especially if you, in the years after the Civil War and the sort of violence of Reconstruction, owning a gun, if you were a black man, could actually put a target on your back for racial violence. I mean, that shows up in, testimonies about racial violence at the time and other sorts of newspaper articles, that men with guns were seen as dangerous, even if they were, what were referred to as like squirrel hunting guns, right? So guns do play a role and what, not only sort of what kind of gun you owned, but how you used it or how you were perceived to be using it.
My man crush on Theodore Roosevelt at this point in time is well established throughout all the lands. It's there. It's out there. But I'm kind of wondering, though, how I don't tend to think of the South as a progressive era bastion, Julia. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how these Southerners are greeting all of these progressive era reform movements when people start talking about conservation and preservation and so forth. I think now, as I explained someone the other day, like hunters that I know of, hunters and fishermen are the premier conservationists in the country. But was this always the case, or were people kind of pushing back against, whoa, what should we do here? Like, how do folks in the South greet this movement?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, those who wanted to see these laws in place became great advocates. And what I'm trying to trace too is the real sort of intellectual kind of discourse happening between Northerners who were in the bird protection and gay protection movement, and how they were conversing with Southerners and really advising and guiding Southerners. So there was a new sort of growing class of, again, people who identified as sportsmen who were really advocating for these laws. And of course, they often had their pulse on the hall, in the echelons of power in the state house, right, in the capital of Southern states. But when those laws were finally passed in this progressive era, Southerners, everyone else, right, they reacted in a number of ways, but there was certainly a broad-based rural resistance that manifested in noncompliance. So people just didn't follow the law. And, you find that wardens have a hard time, getting witnesses to testify that there'd been a breach. There's probate judges have a hard time getting juries to convict people who supposedly violated the new game laws. So these were wildly unpopular. And really, it's not until the 1930s and 40s when the warden system becomes more akin to something like a civil service agency that you start to see more kind of regular enforcement.
I'm familiar with stories of like these wardens who go down into Florida to protect these rookeries during the era, and guys are getting killed. These wardens are getting killed. Is this going on as well, or are they just kind of threatened or shoot off? Like, did you see this at all?
They are threatened sometimes. I mean, sometimes they just write, I'm thinking of Alabama. The creator, the architect of Alabama's Game and Fish Commission was a man named John Wallace, who occupied sort of a central focus of one of the chapters. The man was an amazing bureaucrat, a committed bureaucrat, and saved almost every sort of piece of correspondence he got in. So these Alabama Department of Conservation records, just a heads up for anyone who's interested in exploring these, are pretty remarkable. But he saved all the correspondence from wardens, and they're saying, I'm frightened, like I'm not going to pursue this, or, I know that the powerful don't want me to pursue this. So there was definitely pressures. I don't know of any situation like a Sealy Hook situation, Pennsylvania, Louis Warren, but I certainly were threats, and there was a real reticence to go after people you knew, right? If you were a warden from a certain beat who may be shooting out of season.
You just mentioned John Wallace, and I circled him up. I was like, we got to talk about this dude and so forth. Cause I felt like, as a guy who grew up hunting and fishing and in the South, this is a guy who we need to know about. Like this is a guy you want to talk a little bit more, like, where does he come from? And cause he seems almost revolutionary to me, Julia, and frankly, what he's able to accomplish.
Yeah, he would agree.
A healthy ego isn't bad.
Yeah. He was self-satisfied, which is good. Good, that's good. He was a lawyer and very briefly state legislator in Alabama, from North Alabama, from near Florence. He was a committed conservationist. Really came to be influenced by the conservation movement and bird protection movement of the Northeast, and sort of saw his aim in life to create new kinds of regulation for Alabama. And so, again, briefly a legislator, attempts to pass a game bill. It fails for a variety of reasons. And so he dedicates his, subsequent years to creating a kind of a lobbying organization, and finally writes and, gets enough support in the state legislature to pass the bill that creates the Game and Fish Commission. And the reason why I begin with Alabama in this sort of arc of looking at deep South states is that Alabama really does form a centerpiece in some way. It's the first deep Southern state that's able to pass a bill to create a centralized Game and Fish Commission that actually lasts. So the first case is North Carolina, but Alabama, Wallace finally gets it done, and he's very proud of himself and considers it to be a model, and indeed others do too. And so he starts to sort of go out on the road and proselytize, right? That he's got this great model for winning over other southern states to pass laws that will protect game and some non-game species. But again, comes up against a lot of resistance from ordinary people. So, I think it's really important to note that along with, I think what were very sincere motives, right, to protect game and non-game species, there was also a real motivation to curtail Black mobility. And so when he realizes that these laws are deeply unpopular, he begins to really advertise them as, in his words, the best labor law in the state, right? That because of the kind of policy that's included or wrapped up in these laws, that Black hunters will be kept, on farms in which they work. Guns will be kept out of their hands. It's not clear how he imagined that happening, but he certainly advertised them in that way. And that was that sort of shows up in a lot of different ways, not only in kind of press speeches, but his correspondence and training of wardens, right? So he's, sportsmen at the time across the nation had these sort of boogeymen, right? Like who was doing the overshooting, right? Who was to blame? It was pot hunters, it was game sellers. And it was also non-white people, right? African-American hunters in the South, immigrant hunters in the Northeast. And this was sort of a common trope that you saw among, even the most sort of well-known advocates like William Hornaday and others. So this was not relegated to the South, but it was the South's own version of that kind of, cast of characters.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that you could just trace like Jim Crow legislation through hunting laws, right? All of
it's really an attempt to push Jim Crow into the rural South. How effectively it did that, I think we could debate, but certainly the motives were there, and they were, as no one will be surprised to hear, unveiled.
You mentioned, Alabama was able to get, this Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission established, but you say Mississippi was very late and comparatively in the game, and of course they're right next to each other. Like the cultures are very similar. Why Mississippi? Like, why is this just the heartbeat of like we're going to do what we want kind of thing? Like, what's the difference between Alabama and Mississippi here?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was Wallace's great frustration, right? There's a similar law passed in Georgia pretty quickly after Alabama's in 1911. And so Wallace begins to consult with colleagues in Mississippi trying to get the same model passed. And it just doesn't work. There is a version of a game and fish bill passed that has, again, sort of a weak arm of enforcement, but it really takes until the 90s to create a centralized sort of regulatory body. Yeah, I think that Mississippians thought that the way that Alabama's bill was structured was that the commissioner would be elected, but Mississippians still argued that they felt like as a centralized state body, that position would just become kind of a plum of the governor, and so it would centralize power too much, and so they felt like they wanted these kinds of things decentralized. They didn't want to see a statewide regulation. People argued, on a kind of a version of different ecologies. We might say that a species might be plentiful in one part of the state and not such in another. And so you can't have like a blanket law that would control that. So it took a lot of work. And in this case, on the part of a woman, Fannie Cook, to really, convince the Mississippi legislature that this was a worthy kind of activity of the state, let's say.
I keep thinking now, as far as it feels like Mississippi is totally about local control, a fear of the state and so forth. I keep thinking now, well, golly, United States Forest Service is getting established. I think, early in the 20th century, there are other federal government agencies. This is kind of peripheral, Julia, but are they also pushing back against the creation of these federal agencies, these federal management agencies under Department of Agriculture, Interior, National Parks, so forth? Did you see this at all as well?
No, I think by the time we get to the 1930s, obviously with the advent of the New Deal, those folks who wanted to see game and fish regulation were in cooperative partnerships with federal agencies. And in fact, I think that sort of helps these laws find purchase, right? That there are these federal entities that are kind of there to, for example, create public lands, right? That hunters could access in an environment that was, in which land was increasingly being consolidated, either by agriculture industries like timber in the Delta or by hunters who were now, by the early 20th century, sort of forming hunting clubs, buying land, leasing land to sort of consolidate it for their own uses.
We have a section here called What the Florida.
I love it. I have so many What the Florida stories.
Well, you and I both have a love of my adopted homeland. Lived for a few years in Tally as well.
Nice.
Got great restaurants there. There's a place, the Red Hills region. You want to talk about this? Because Florida, I've always found, Julia, exists outside the imagination when it comes to like early America, even the South. People like Florida's its own nebulous thing. Very much northern Florida is very much a factor in your story here. Can we talk about the story of the Red Hills, of Charlie Young? Like, what's going on here? Why do we need to know this?
Yeah, I mean, and I will say too that this book was born there.
Yeah.
Appropriately in the woods of the Red Hills. Because I did a master's degree in public history at Florida State. And while I was there, I was hired by a historical society in Thomasville, Georgia, which is the kind of cultural hub of the Red Hills region on the northern end. And I was hired to do collect oral histories of Thomas Countyans, and many of those were tied to the quail hunting plantations that arose in the late 19th century. Land was purchased by wealthy Northerners associated with big industries like Standard Oil and others, and they consolidated land to form, again, these quail hunting preserves. And I had no idea that phenomenon existed.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand that there had been these hunting colonies. I didn't realize how much it impacted the kind of fabric of this community, this small corner of the South. And I became incredibly fascinated at how this sort of local hunting culture really reflected broader themes of, change and tension in Southern history. And so when I was doing that research, my dissertation was more kind of a community study in some ways. It was about the hunting and the hunting plantations, but it was more about how that history formed a narrative that the county told about itself, or that community told about itself. But when I was doing that, when I was doing that research, I realized that these hunting preserves became incredibly divisive. And they became divisive because they were gobbling up land that could have been put under the plow and was being used for hunting, like a leisure activity, right, by sportsmen who had a lot of money, sometimes owned the Pullman cars that brought them down. And the most vociferous critics of that were former populists. So it was this sort of interesting thread of the afterlife of populism. Like, what were these guys doing after this sort of movement, dislocated, right, in the 20th century? And so I was really fascinated by that. And I started thinking, okay, well, they're upset about land and they're upset about laws. So they're blaming these Northerners for, influencing game and fish laws to reflect elite interests. And I thought, well, is that true? And I couldn't find much scholarship on that. Like there's a great unpublished dissertation from UGA from 1970 that dives into some of it, but otherwise this didn't really exist. And so that's why this book was born. It was like the book that I wish I would have had when I was writing the dissertation. And yes, so the Red Hills, back to your initial question. Sorry for that tangent.
We are tangent friendly here, by the way.
Okay, good. As a Southerner, I'm not surprised with that.
Oh my gosh, we hate awkward silences, do we not? I can't do it. I'm sorry, keep going.
Yeah, so one of the chapters sort of looks at the Red Hills region as a microcosm, right, of land change, land use change in the South in the late 19th to 20th century, and really looks at this phenomenon of buying and leasing land for leisure, right? And that was also connected to new changes within scientific management of land, right? So I'm thinking about Bert Way's book on Herbert Stoddard, who was a scientist who came down to sort of help these northern quail estate owners manage their land so that quail would be more plentiful. So it's an important moment for sort of wildlife science, right? And now there are, agencies like Tall Timbers in the Red Hills that are at the forefront of ecological land management, right? So there's sort of a tandem there, and the sort of birth of leisure, the use of land for leisure and new forms of science and ecological protection.
My dear friend Angela Pulley Hudson is always on me. I went off on a tangent the other day myself. She's always reminding me as I'm writing, Jason, where are the women? Jason, where are the women? Angela, God bless you. I love you so very, very much. Julia, where are the women in this story? You have this great piece on Fanny Cook, who you mentioned a little bit earlier, and her importance here. Women are not just cleaning the animals here as the hunters are coming back in here. The women are very much vocal as far as land use policy as well. How do women factor into like the ways in which land is being used and conserved, and where are their voices, especially when they don't have the right to even vote throughout much of the story here?
Right. I mean, women, especially elite white women, were incredibly important to the story in the Red Hills, right? Women, inherit those quail hunting plantations. I mentioned, they're interested in horsemanship and fox hunts and things, and they begin to do their own hunting by the 20s and 30s. And I think that women become incredibly important by the 1920s and 1930s after the 19th Amendment passed, but also those women who sort of, were part of this progressive era, took advantage of this progressive era emphasis on women's education, right? So women who were coming of age in the turn of the 20th century, white women and Black women too, were becoming more, as they were organizing themselves into clubs of various kinds. Conservation was absolutely part of that work. And so both Black and white women, especially in the club movement, were dedicated to issues of conservation. So there were, forestry committees within these women's clubs. But what I appreciated about the Fannie Cook story, so Fannie Cook is a woman born in the late 19th century from Mississippi, from Crystal Springs, Mississippi. She's a scientist. She sort of takes it upon herself to finally gain enough allies, gain enough influence to really pressure Mississippi to create a centralized game and fish body. What she wanted was not so much for, the sake of hunters. What she wanted was, she wanted a statewide survey of Mississippi's flora and fauna. She was really influenced by Aldo Leopold and other ecologists like Paul Barsh and others at the Smithsonian and up in Washington, D.C. She wanted to see conservation of non-game species as well as flora. And so this was her way to do that, right? She understood the influence of hunters and fishers. She very savvily uses federal money as it starts to come in. And she's also supported by women in the Mississippi legislature at the time who, again, bearing the fruits of the 19th Amendment and of education, gained seats in the Mississippi legislature, and then were sort of sidelined to the Parks Committee, right? Because that's where their male colleagues thought that they should go. But then they were the ones who helped shepherd in all of this great New Deal money to preserve lands and to, create biological surveys and other things that Fannie Cook wished for. So, yes, I agree that women are not silent and they are incredibly active in this process.
I want to talk about another woman in the process of this, and that's actually you, because you're researching this and you're writing this, but you're also talking now, Julia, in the epilogue here, to descendants, to people who are still on these lands. You have frequented these lands yourself. You know these spaces. I'm kind of interested here in the legacy, because you had to make some very real decisions on how far forward do I carry this story, and why. Can you talk a little bit? And I don't know if this ties into the stag or not, but kind of where the legacy of of all of these decisions carries forth to today, because now we're talking, golly, 80, 90 years, since New Deal. What's the ramifications of all of these, of the transformation of the hunting practices here when we're talking about land, law, use, class, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's profound. I think we're still sort of living in the legacy of this moment. I mean, even, I know a lot of hunters here in Alabama. And, when you talk to hunters today, right, there's, the criteria for hunting is gear, as you know, right? Sometimes really expensive gear, and land. And how do you access land? You either have to own land, or you have to be in a position to lease land, or you access the wildlife management areas and other public lands in which public hunting is allowed, which are small in terms of acreage in the Deep South, and many feel like they're overhunted. I think others would disagree. And one of the hunters I interviewed for the epilogue, Durrell Smith, who is a wonderful artist, educator, public historian. I would absolutely call him a public historian, dog guide, upland bird hunter. He, or dog trainer and upland hunter guide, I should say. Sorry, I think that's the 7 o'clock hour rolling in my brain. He makes it a point to go hunting on, for example, wildlife management areas, because his argument is, If the scientists and the Game and Fish Commission say that animals are there, they're there. And those that's sort of like our modern day commons, right? That's where we can access. I don't need money to access that, right? Like that's land that is open and it's supposed to be sort of public pursuit. But, I interviewed scientists within these bodies too. And there's some frustration around the North American model of wildlife conservation that's heavily based on the sale of arms and ammunition, right? However anyone feels about that, a lot of the sort of revenue generated comes from those sales. So that means that, for example, in Georgia, they're building more shooting ranges instead of diverting that money into, other kinds of conservation programs that are, let's say, more urban, focused in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. And so, I think, we don't need to tell policymakers in this arena sort of what some of the legacies of this progressive era moment are, but I think they're marked.
Yeah, I kept thinking as well, there's this third body here that goes into it as far as, because I was thinking when I was living in Tallahassee, all of these quail grounds they're all private. Like if you want to go there, and it felt like this bougie thing that I Jason Herbert could not access. And I still very much, Julia, carry the idea that I'm a poor white Kentuckian on my shoulder, like a chip. It's almost like a badge of honor at this point in time. And then you've got these other wildlife management areas. And then I'm thinking about feral animals. You mentioned people killing songbirds and so forth. I started thinking about, my beloved whippoorwills of the South, which we don't have here in Colorado, and I miss them.
That's great.
I know, right? Whippoorwills, they just sing all night.
Yeah.
Feral hogs, are just everywhere throughout the South. They haven't made their way up here as well. I don't know if this is kind of a side thing, but they seem to be this other lurking thing, this nebulous kind of thing as well.
Yeah, they were not protected. You might have seen that, but hawks, screech owls, others were seen as menaces to the farmer, and so never had protection in this era. By the way.
No, and probably shouldn't. Like, I feel bad for the pigs, but I mean, you and I have both seen what a hog can do to a field. The farmer said,
"I'm so sorry. You said hog. I heard hawk."
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm talking about hogs. The feral hogs out there.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's still an issue, right, for farmers and others in many different kinds of land. Do you hunt hogs?
I used to, right? But I remember the last time I hunted hog, I was in North Florida. I was living in Tallahassee, and they were just everywhere. I got treed by a hog. Like hogs are mean. They'll run you right up a tree. Like I have friends of mine who don't like to hunt them at all because they're a dangerous animal. You've got, people think about deer as big, and deer can be big, but hogs are bigger, and they've got teeth, and they're super smart, and they know what you're doing out there. Do you want to talk about the painting behind you?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Well, it
No.
leads to something that came up in our correspondence, which is the broader culture of hunting in the South, right? Like where it shows up. So not just in the activity in the fields and woods, but sort of how it influences the way we imagine the South, how it influences literature and movies and other things that, are sort of occupied with the South. But I hung these, they look like they maybe they were made for a nursery or something, because they're kind of in these pastel threads. They were embroidered, but I found them in a Mississippi junk store. And I say that with affection because junk is a relative term. But there's three of them. It's a little triptych. And on the back, there's actually some provenance written. They were made by a woman in rural Mississippi, and they were embroidered on the back of a fertilizer sack using a pattern from a Southern Farm Association magazine back in the 50s, and I just thought, I hung them as I was writing because I thought, really this stuff, it's sort of in the ether, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in Alabama where I live, that hunting culture kind of pervades the way that sort of the rural South has been remembered. I also think because it's a sanctioned form of violence, that there's a really easy slippage into transgression. And so it shows up in literature, we both read Stephen Graham Jones recently. That's not Southern, obviously, but hunting, right, sort of features in some of his horror novels. Or I was, Jessamine Ward's book, Sing Unburied Sing. One of the first scenes of that is basically a murder committed in the field and then passed off as a hunting accident of one of the protagonist's older brothers, So I think it is underexplored. I will come back to that point. And I think, the book that I wrote felt like a first, like a small, a very humble offering. It's something much bigger that I hope other people will pick up. And just as a shout out, there are other historians who have picked it up, unrelated to me. But there's recently been a work published by University of Alabama Press by historian Buckley Foster on market hunting in Arkansas, which has very similar themes as to the book I wrote. There's a new edited volume coming out from UGA Press on the history of hunting in South Carolina. Dan Vivian, a historian at the University of Kentucky, has looked at the sporting plantations in the Low Country. And so there is this kind of moment where it is occupying the mind of Southern historians in a way that it hasn't really up to this point. And it's I think there's so much there, and I think there's even more to be discovered.
No, I think it absolutely is. I have to imagine that, there in Tuscaloosa, you've got students coming in. I have to imagine wearing real tree or mossy oak. I mean, it is a form of identity for people. Like, I am a hunter and I have hunted and I still hunt with my grandfather's gun or my father's gun and so forth, right? This is very akin to like a very sense of a personality, right? Like who a person is and what they do. Like, the New Deal was not far long ago.
Right.
Especially when I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And there's this, I just saw recently the Supreme Court declined to hear the case on the corner crossing issue that's going on some of the lands out, and so forth. People are you familiar with this issue at all?
Yeah, but I don't know, maybe listeners won't.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So for listeners, right, the idea is like if you've got essentially square grids of land and you're trying to get to public land, you kind of have to cross across this like almost imaginary 1-inch line from one spot to another. And you've got property owners on the other sides who are saying, you can't do this. It's illegal. I've got my rights involved. Like the idea of who can hunt where is still very much rooted. I still feel, Julia, in class.
Yes. Relatedly, I just watched a recorded meeting of the Alabama Legislative Committee, who were gathering to hear an attempt by the Department of Conservation to pass a new code that would give more teeth, essentially, to dogs, to hunting dogs, especially deer hunting dogs, running on private property. And at the heart of the issue was, because landowners were there to testify, this was in the Talladega National Forest,
Mm-hmm.
that hunters who were using the WMA over the forest over there were letting their dogs run, and they weren't able to master or manage those dogs. And those dogs were running onto people's hunting, property and scaring off their deer that they might want to hunt with their, grandchild. Right. So it got very heated. And at one point, again, somebody brought up the fear of death threats from these dog hunters, but there was a tinge of class, right, to the descriptions of people sort of using the national forest and running their dogs like they couldn't control their dogs, right? They didn't have the right gear to control all of these things sort of play into it. So just to add on to your point, I think that's absolutely right.
We've been talking about all this stuff in the past. You've now you finished this. I don't even know how. I'm terrified of writing my book. I'm not even kidding. What happens for you in the future? Like, are you the kind of person who does like multiple projects in your head, or like, are you taking a breather? What comes next for you?
That's a good question. As a public historian and the work that I do in the South, I don't really have, I don't consider, for example, I'm probably not going to write another book on hunting, right? Or like, I don't consider this my sort of niche or specialty, but it did grow out of a public history project. And so I have ongoing public history work that is, community-based and that's leading to different kinds of scholarship that manifest in things like exhibits or oral history projects. In terms of writing, there are parts of this research that didn't make it into the book because I had a tight word count as part of my contract, which was nice, but then also left some things out. So there's more on that I'd like to publish. I've been interviewing Bill Baxley, who was the 1970s or the state attorney general in the 1970s, elected at the same time Wallace came in for another term. And Baxley was really interesting. He was influenced by the civil rights movement. He ended up prosecuting the first of prosecuting one of the Klansmen who perpetrated the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And so he's this interesting sort of figure and a kind of an oppositional figure in some ways to Wallace, who was operating at the same time. He also started the first Environmental Protection Bureau within the state AG. And so I'm interested in that. We disagree on some things. And so I'm interested in what it means to disagree with your interview partner. And maybe there's something to write there. But he's also, I think he's an interesting figure in terms of state politics. And there might be something emerging there too.
Well, I'm ready for the next stuff. Like I told you, I picked this up and I just started tearing through the thing just as fast as I possibly could. But for me, Julia, this was relevant to my life, even though I'm not quite like some of these folks down in Alabama will not say Kentucky's from the South. And then, of course, then there's fighting words.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, go ahead.
I mean, in your hunting, how has your hunting changed from region to region, from sort of upper South to?
Okay, so they're bigger here in Colorado, right?
Yeah.
So I was literally looking. I'd kind of, it was an interesting thing with me because my father was looked like Hank Williams Jr. And Dad, I come from a long line of cat fishermen, which I'll tell you about in off the thing here in a second. I don't want to make this about me, but it was like, this was a thing that like my father did, so I rejected it as a young man. Like I did not want. I was going to be smart, right? Because hunting was something you did when you were dumb and you were a hillbilly or whatever. This was my impression that when I was a kid, right, as a snotty little teenage little thing down in Western Kentucky. And then as I got older, I was like, no, this is a thing I want to embrace. My grandfather hunts. Like these are the lands that I grew up on. How can I possibly love nature if I don't hunt nature? How can I possibly respect the animal if I don't hunt the animal? I very much, Julia, believe that like the death that I would give to any animal when I hunt it is far more noble than anything at a slaughterhouse for cattle or something like that. And I think there's a real kinship with it. But you know how it is when you become an academic, it just takes over your life and there's really no room for anything else. And hunting is such a thing where people eat, sleep, and breathe this thing, and they prepare for it all year long. And now I'm out here in Colorado, and now there are elk, and elk weigh 800, 900 pounds, and they live at 10,000 feet, and I'm out of breath when I walk to the fridge, which apparently I do a lot. So it's a whole other world where I'm just literally earlier today going, okay, well, looking at hunting next year here in Colorado, because it's like, okay, I'm home. I guess Colorado is home now, so that means I also have to start hunting here. And I guess maybe that's what I'm trying to get at, is this idea that home is where I hunt, because these are the lands. So I guess a little bit of that, but I've never really considered I always say, like, I walk into the Dungeons and Dragons store and never feel nerdy enough. And I go to Bass Pro Shops and I never feel like I'm, macho or hunty enough. I don't know. I always feel like I feel a bit odd when it comes to that stuff. And I'm still trying to figure out my identity when it comes to that stuff. So, there's a whole other thing to be talked about there. So, yeah.
I do think that there is there's room for public history of hunting and fishing, that I've never really, I think one thing I would love to see is hunters interviewing each other. I mean, as you said, hunters are on the front lines. So these men and women across the country and are on the front lines of climate change, of changes to species habitat. They're watching things like chronic wasting disease in the South, right? And I think they're also, forming traditions and they're sharing strategies and those kinds of things. And I think it's worth those stories being preserved. And I think hunters are natural storytellers. And so it would be nice to see something like that. I think the closest thing I've ever seen to something like an exhibit or something on hunting, of course, most recently in New Orleans at the Historic New Orleans Collection, there was a great exhibit on the craftsmanship of duck decoys in coastal Louisiana. So it was this really, these beautiful kind of crafted decoys that were so intricate. But yeah, those kinds of things I would love to see emerge.
Yeah, and it's like I kind of made this clip earlier. It's like when I was a kid, looking at like my dad as being dumb or something like that because it's like a redneck up in the woods. But the reality is just like you're saying, or everybody says like if you go to Bass Pro Shops, it says welcome hunters, fishermen, and other liars, right? Because you're talking about the storytelling aspect of that, but also like hunters are scientists. You cannot spend that much time out in the woods or out in the rivers or out wherever and not be uniquely attuned to like landscape management, climate, like you're talking about climate change, behavior, vegetation. These guys are watching, men and women are watching all of this stuff. They are hyper aware of what's going on, and like you're very much on the front lines. Now, the only person I think of is like Steven Ranella of this meat eater thing I was telling you about, because he's a hunter but a storyteller, but he's also like land management. These folks know this, so there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be done. I think about Durrell Smith again, the kind of narrator for the epilogue, and again, he's really a public historian. He works with a group of Black men who formed a Black dog field trial, a group in the Red Hills, basically. And he's built sort of a cultural archive, even in the movements that he uses when he's training dogs and when he's, hunting. And the way he talks about it is so intricate and almost precious, right? Because this is transmitted knowledge that otherwise wouldn't be there, right? And so, yeah, I would love. I mean, it's all there, waiting to be captured and preserved.
Yeah, I can tell you. I was reading the book. I made a note as I was reading the book. I was like, get Durrell Smith on the podcast. I want to talk to this dude.
He's wonderful, and he and his wife are wonderful, and they're doing a lot of cool stuff. So I think, and he has his own podcast, so maybe you could go on his.
Yeah, I could be like, listen, how to not shoot things in the woods, because I'm a good shot. But you open that book with shooting doves, and like doves are just merciless on hunters. They're so hard to shoot. So
that's why, it's amazing to me. I mean, because there was probably a lot of liquor in those hunts too, and it's amazing to me that
we survived it all. That we survived the 80s.
I survived my childhood. That we survived it all. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so that's the perfect. We should just retitle. We should actually start a new podcast called "Surviving the '80s," the Jason and Julia trauma show. So we could just do that. So I was so looking forward to talking to you for the longest time. It took a bit to schedule because of the whole fires and so forth. But I'm so glad to finally get to talk to you. I can't tell you, like, just on a personal, professional level. Thank you so much for coming on. This was awesome.
This is such a treat. Thank you for having me, and thank you for reading the book and allowing me to sort of reflect on it.
I love this book. If you're listening in, and I'll post links to this later on, but Closed Seasons, The Transformation of Hunting in the Modern South by Dr. Julia Brock. Awesome.